So we're going to finish up talking about the economics of America. I told y'all in episode 8, we started to talk about certain economic concepts, and I wanted to dedicate more time to be able to talk about those things and ideas. And so I'm going to take some time to do that. A couple of things. And this is such a tough conversation. I'm going to be honest with you. I truly don't know where to begin. But I have to start off giving a history lesson, because in order for us to understand how we arrived to where we are today, we have to understand the history that got us here. So from a financial standpoint, we have to go all the way to the Revolutionary War to kind of set the stage. And that's almost like the beginning of America per se as we know it. The biggest challenge that the founding fathers of America faced was getting under the thumb of the regime of the mother country, which was Great Britain, that still controlled commerce, economics, and so much through taxes and things like that. Most of the people that would flee from Great Britain to settle in what is now known as America, it wasn't the best and brightest per se. This was people that had been economically disenfranchised due to the high tariffs and tax placed on the populace under the rule of the monarchy back in those times in Great Britain. So they say, we got to flee at this point because it was life or death. And it's this new land, it's this quote unquote new world where we'll be able to set up and build a new life. So that was the perception that was created. Now, the reason why I go back that far is because what created the economic disenfranchisement back then was the control over the central banking system of that time, control over the tariffs and taxes that was being levied against the average person at that time, that created the economic trials and troubles that they had to have experienced to make them say, I'm willing to go anywhere than to stay here. So now we fast forward to present day, and not to present day. From there, much of the American independence that took place under the Revolutionary War was about separating themselves from Great Britain. America was almost successful in that separation. And when I say almost successful, at the surface, we were able to separate. We were able to create our own system of government. We created the Declaration of Independence and all of that, right? On the surface. But when you look underneath it, when you peel back the layers, the central banking barons of Great Britain and of Europe still had economic influence over the Americas. Every subsequent war that was fought in America, from the Revolutionary War over the next 100 to 200 years, there was an economic influence specifically by the central banking systems that existed and still exist in Europe. Now, I got to slow walk you through this. Remember, I told you it's a process, right? So now you look at whether it's the War of 1812, whether it's the Civil War, whether it's going into World War I and so forth. I kid you not, the influence of the economic infrastructure and the central banking barons of Europe is present in every single American war that has been fought since its inception, going all the way back to the Revolutionary War. All right, why do I feel like that's a viable place to start the conversation? Well, one, I told you it's important that we know the history. Two, the last time that America was quote unquote debt free, if you had to guess, what time do you think that was? The last time that America had because they always, every day on the news, the national debt is increased. It's this trillion, 5 trillion, 10 trillion, 13 trillion. And they always talk about this debt increasing. Have you ever stopped to ask yourself, okay, who are we in debt to? Because if there is a debt and there's a debtee, there has to be a debtor. You can't have a debt without someone that you owe the debt to. So now, I told you, We don't want to make statements anymore. We want to ask questions. A lot of the information that I've been privileged to be exposed to and learn about is because I didn't make statements. No matter what room I'm in, I always ask questions. And the more and more I ask questions, the more and more information is revealed to me. And remember, I told you, information is the greatest commodity. So now that we have that perspective, that we have that purview, we'll realize, now let's revisit what the founding fathers were talking about. Whether it was Thomas Jefferson, or whether it was Benjamin Franklin, or many others. They, even back then, I'm talking about in the 1700s, you know what the greatest threat to this idea of American democracy that they was trying to create was? The privatized banking barons, the privatized robber barons that were literally what's the word I'm looking for? I'm going to say enslaving, for lack of a better expression, literally enslaving the public at large, enslaving the public at large under the thumb of this economic oppression. Resources, currency, loans, interest rates, all of those things, right? These are financial concepts. Now let's talk about how the American financial system came to be present day. So now we got a little understanding of the history. Again, it's so much information to be gathered there, but I try to be, very thorough with giving you the cliff notes. So there's always been a problem with the influence of the central banking cartels, specifically in Europe, on the presence in America, on the establishment of America, and what the founding fathers were really writing the Declaration of Independence and all of those things from. It wasn't just the mother country of Great Britain, but it was also the thumb of economic oppression that the robber barons of the time had on the ability to be able to live, like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those three, they felt like those things were in constant attack by the robber barons. So there were several attempts from 1776 to 1912. There was several attempts in that approximate 140-year span of the mother country in Great Britain trying to establish a central banking system to control the currency of America. And they would try and they would fail. They were literally every war was pretty much fought in America as a result of something to do with that. So now that we understand that, right? How did we get into the economic system that we have present day? So we operate under what's called fractional reserve economics. We have a central banking system known as the Federal Reserve. Every dollar in circulation has been loaned to the American government by the Federal Reserve to be paid back with interest. So let's talk about the establishment of the Federal Reserve. It's a great book. I've read it several times, but it's a great book called The Creature from Jekyll Island that I recommend everybody with interest in finance or economics or history to read so you can understand. Again, if we don't know our history, we are bound to repeat it. So I established the history economically. I established the influence of Great Britain. I established the influence of the central banking system that they were trying to create. Before I get into the Federal Reserve, let me answer the question that I posed to you about the last time America was debt-free. In recorded history, the last time America had no debt was when Abraham Lincoln suspended the central bank of that time and instituted the greenback. The greenback was the first iteration of paper currency not backed by gold in the United States. The reason why Abraham Lincoln created the greenback is because that was the only way he was going to be able to financially support the Union in the Civil War. So the greenback was the first iteration of currency, paper currency, not backed by some sort of natural resources gold. So it was truly the first promissory note. The only thing that gave the greenback its value was Abraham Lincoln saying this is a legal tender and then people exchanging it in commerce. Let's think about that. The last time we were debt free, the central bank of the time was suspended indefinitely. Put a pin in that because we're going to come back to that idea. So here we are now. Fast forward, because the Civil War, 1860 to 1865, that 4 or 5 year span, right? Now we're going to fast forward 50 years to the early 1900s. And in the early 1900s, this was the financial influence of Europe. This is their next attempt to undermine the American government. And this will ultimately be the most successful. So what do I mean by that? The financial interests, the robber barons of the early 1900s, they came together to consolidate power, and they conspired to commandeer the financial sector of the United States and subsequently the world by implementing and instituting what became known as the Federal Reserve Act. Before this Federal Reserve Act was signed into law by Woodrow Wilson, these quote unquote financial interests, privatized bankers, and robber barons met in a place called Jekyll Island, Georgia. It's a tiny island off of the coast of southeast Georgia. All of the big players was involved. I don't have to name them. I want you to do a little research to find out who those players were. But all of the big financial players was involved at the time. They all took a private train all the way down to Jekyll Island, Georgia. They all signed in on the manifest under assumed names. It was a level of secrecy enshrouded around this entire meetup. And the purpose of this meetup was for them to come together, consolidate power, and draft what would become the Federal Reserve Act. The act that was signed into law for how the economics of this country is to operate was not passed through some normal form of legislation. It was not drafted and written and constructed by elected officials, right? But this is what ultimately fashioned our day-to-day life, present day, when it comes to the economics that we exist in. So now you have privatized bankers that wrote the rule of law that's going to govern the economics of this country. Then that was just the first step. Okay, let's draft what this provision will look like. The next step, now we have to get a candidate that we can get into office under our influence, so we have the path of least resistance and it doesn't die in the Senate or House of Representatives. So then they were very careful and calculated with whom they picked. And that's when you talk about the consolidation of power through secret societies. So they selected one of their own. That one of their own was Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, then they put all the money behind his campaign. They put all the resources behind his campaign. These same financial leaders, they had, guess what? They controlled the radio waves. They controlled the airwaves. Think of AM, FM radio. So now they have the biggest propaganda platform. Oh, who that sound like? Remember, I told you the playbook don't change. It's the same thing, right? So they controlled the propaganda machine, and they made sure that their candidate was the one to win and attain the White House. And he did. And they made sure that they influenced the congressional members that they needed to. And that's exactly what they did. Believe it or not, it's another book called War is a Racket. I encourage everybody to read that book. It's a very easy read. War is a Racket. It's by General Smedley Butler, World War I, highly touted military general who wrote this book because he realized the truth about these wars and it being just an extension of the financial arm for control over resource and power. It was not about spreading democracy or any other propagandized notion that they tended to perpetuate back then. And General Smedley Butler realized that. And when he realized that, that's what made him write this book called War is a Racket. The reason why I bring him up is because initially the proposal to be this candidate, this patsy in the White House, was brought to General Butler. They tried to get General Smedley Butler to play along first, to be what Woodrow Wilson ultimately being. And General Butler did the opposite. He played along with him, just to get the information. And then he started his own campaign. Like, yo, these people crazy. They trying to sell a country to the privatized bankers. We got to do something about it. So that's, again, a whole nother story for another day. They got their man. Their man was Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson ended up signing the Federal Reserve Act into law, and that established the economic system that we have today. On his deathbed, it is alleged, because this information has not been able to be corroborated yet, but it is alleged that on his deathbed, Woodrow Wilson said, I fear I've sold my people. He said, I feared I've sold the country to the privatized bankers and the privatized financial interests and the global elitists that want to run this world. That is what is to have been alleged that he said in his deathbed as a confession of signing the Federal Reserve Act into law. Now, again, I told you it's a lot. It's a lot of information, but I got to give it to you. I need y'all to bear with me. So a couple of things happened around that time that the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law. One of the things was there was a panic. It was a rumor that sent the financial industry in a panic, because you got to remember, before the centralized banking was deregulated. There was no centralized regulation governing all banks prior to this Federal Reserve Act, and they needed to get all banks on board to what they were operating in order to allow the economics to work how they intended to, this idea of fractional reserve banking, and I'll explain that in a moment. So it was lies being spread about local banks. They was using the media outlets, the propaganda of the time, to say your money is not safe, take it out the banks. It's better served under your mattress than in the banks. This is the type of propaganda that was being perpetuated back then. And naturally, the people who don't know, they were unassuming. They believed the propaganda. And guess what they did? They went and they call it, the present day terminology is called a run on the banks. There was a run on the banks. What that means is people went and they withdrew their money from the banks. And that withdrawal of the money crippled the financial banks and crippled the financial system as it was. That was strategic. They then, now that everybody have their money out the banks, all of those smaller banks don't have the insurance. This is prior to the FDIC. The FDIC is a faction. It's an establishment of the Federal Reserve Act. So there's no insurance on the money. What happens now? The bigger banks, JP Morgan Chase, Rothschild, so on and so forth. Guess what they do? They come and consolidate all of those smaller banks. So now, if you and I had a bank, I had the bank of Kay Nellz on this block, you had the bank of that on that block, JP Morgan Chase came, bought it up once we couldn't have the money to be able to satisfy the run on the bank. And then guess what they did? They bought all of those, bought my bank, all of those little banks, and now it ain't the bank of Kay Nellz anymore, it's Chase Bank, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Truist, etc. When that run on the bank happened, then they started the positive propaganda. Hey, everything is okay now. We, the big banks, acquired the smaller banks in order to protect your money. It's safe. Go ahead and bring it back. And guess what people did? Oh, I have faith in these banks now. And they brought their money back. Also, another wing of the propaganda tool. Remember, I told you they use fear and they use ignorance to control. Well, it has been documented, and this is, you can do the research yourself, but I will say this has been documented and corroborated. The first ever UFO sighting, you know when it took place? During the panic of the stock market, in the panic of when they had all of the banks scared. Again, guess who controlled the radios? The number one controller of the largest network of AM, FM radios in the country at the time was none other than Mr. Rockefeller. So it's no coincidence that at a time where he was a part of the group that consolidated that power through the Federal Reserve Act to now have the banks be controlled by the financial system of America to be controlled by the privatized banks. All of this panic is being incited. And I don't believe in coincidence. There's no coincidence that the first UFO sighting or alien propaganda was perpetuated through his newspapers, him being Rockefeller, and his AM, FM radio stations. All of this stuff took place while they were literally commandeering, the privatized banks were commandeering the power and wealth of America into the central bank. Guess what happened shortly after that? The Great Depression. The Great Depression is what transpired shortly after that. And the Great Depression was all a part of that consolidation of wealth. They had to, and I know this part is alleged, this is where they'll consider me a conspiracy theorist, but this is what I explain. In order for central banks to consolidate the currency and the power of the currency to itself, they had to literally drain and deplete all of the tangible golden coin from the population itself. So yes, it's documented. They went door to door, knocking on doors and collecting gold and valuables from people during the Great Depression. It was, again, I encourage everybody to trust but verify. Please look into this and do the research yourself. All of the Great Depression was a function of the Federal Reserve Act and the Panic of 1912 and all of the things that happened with the stock market and the financial sectors that took place while they consolidated the power. Hear me out. We getting somewhere now. I need y'all to follow. I need you to pick up what I'm putting down. So now you got the Rockefellers, you got the Carnegies, you got the J.P. Morgans, you got the Rothschilds, you got the DuPonts, I'm talking about all of the financial interest of America down at Jekyll Island to write this Federal Reserve Act and then put their patsy into the White House so that they can ensure that it's signed into law. And then what takes place over the subsequent 20 and 30 years, I'm going to say leading up to World War II, was all a function of this new consolidation of power to the centralized banks. Now that everybody understands, and again, always check, but verify. Always trust, but verify. Even me. Question me. Do your own research. Look into it. I'm only just presenting the information because information is the greatest commodity. Now that we understand how the Federal Reserve came to be, let's talk about what the Federal Reserve is. So let's look at fractional reserve banking. Fractional reserve banking says this: for every dollar that a bank have in reserve, it can loan out up to 10, I'm going to just say 10 times that amount. So for every dollar I have, I'm going to consider myself a bank. I have a bank, right? The only thing that I have in my bank is $10. Based off of that $10, I can loan 10 different people $10 that they have to pay back to me with interest. Hear me out. I need y'all to follow me, please. I only have $10. This is how money is created out of thin air. And this is why there's always been, you know what? I'm not going to be anticlimactic. Follow me and you'll get to the point that I'm making. I have $10. Based on that $10, based on fractional reserve banking, I can loan 10 different people $10 based off of the loan $10 that I have into my account. And not only can I loan them that $10, 10 different people $10, I can then force them to pay me back that $10 with interest. So not only do they have to, I've loaned 10 different people $10 based off of my $10 that I have in reserve, and they have to pay me back $11. Guess what I just made off of $10? 100 just off of the principal. I made off of $10. I just made $100 by loaning 10 different people $10. I just made $100 off of the 10 that I have in reserve, and I never had to physically give the 10. My $10. My $10 stayed in reserve. Then on top of that, the principal was just the 10. Each of them paid me back $11. I made $110 off of $10 in my reserve. That's on a small scale. Now, let's look at the financial institutions that we have today. For every dollar that they have in reserve, they can loan out $10 to be paid back with interest. How is money created? How is debt created? out of thin air. It's not real. So follow me. I just made $110 off of $10 that I had in reserve, and I never had to give out the $10. Really. This is how money is. I have to ask. So how is money created? This is how debt is created. This is how money is created. Debt equals money under a fractional reserve banking. So now, when I say the last time that America was debt free was when Abraham Lincoln suspended the central bank of that time during the Civil War and instituted the greenback, a currency not backed by anything, right? Not backed by gold or natural resource, a true promissory note. That was the last time America was debt free. As long as there has been an existence of a central banking system, there has been the existence of debt, because in a central banking system, in fractional reserve banking, debt is money and money is debt. Follow me. You come into the dealership to buy a car from me. I talk to the bank on your behalf based on your credentials. I send it over to them to say, I am asking for $30,000 in debt on behalf of XYZ. They look at your credentials, they cross-reference it with the deal structure and say, okay, we're going to loan the $30,000 to this individual to be paid back with interest in monthly installments. Numbers in the computer of the bank is sent over to numbers in computer of the dealership. And then you work your career, your hard-earned money to put direct deposits into the bank. They loaned you your money back. And then you take that money that you worked hard for to make a car payment. And then they've loaned you your own money back. You work hard and take the new money that you've earned to pay them back for a loan that they loaned you based on your money being in reserve. This is how, please tell me you rocking with me. This is how the Federal Reserve works. This is how fractional reserve banking works. It is so imperative that we understand how the financial sector of this country works in order for us to be able to know how to play the game, to be a player in the game. So no money was actually transacted until you took your hard-earned money and made a car payment to a bank that loaned you the money based off of your own money that you have in their bank. So let's talk constitutionality. The Constitution says Congress queens money. By the law, by the letter of the Constitution, the existence of the Federal Reserve is unconstitutional. And here's the biggest travesty, because the Federal Reserve is not a federal entity. It is a private bank. It is no more federal, and I'll explain this and I'll say this a million times. I said it in episode 8. The Federal Reserve is no more federal than Federal Express. The FedEx that deliver your packages is not a government entity. It is a private company, and it has nothing to do with the government. The Federal Reserve is nothing to do with the federal government. It is a private bank with private interest. With that being said, the Federal Reserve controls the amount of money in circulation. It controls the interest rates on the loans that's given out, and it controls inflation. I said this on episode 8. I'll repeat it here. Those three things have more effect on the day-to-day life of a common man, of the common human being, the average American, more than any politician, regulatory agency, or anything that exists. And nobody is calling for the abolishment of the Federal Reserve Act or the Federal Reserve Law or the Federal Reserve. You want to know why? Because those same financial interests that compromised Woodrow Wilson and many other politicians of that time is the same financial interests that compromise the same politicians present day. But instead, they just call them lobbyists. They included it in the game to continue the influence, to continue the control. So now debt is being controlled by the Federal Reserve. Interest rates is being controlled by the Federal Reserve. The cost of a gallon of milk has increased exponentially over the last 100 years, even though the cost of producing that same gallon of milk has not increased at all over the last hundreds of years, over the last 50, 60, 70 years. The inflation that we see, the economic disenfranchisement that we see, poor people struggling the way we see, is a direct result of fractional reserve banking and the Federal Reserve controlling things that by the Constitution elected officials is supposed to control. So when you see debt the way you see it, when you see the debt ceiling, you know, they call it the debt ceiling. They use fancy financial language to confuse the average person, but they're just talking about debt. When you see the misappropriation of funds, when you see the irresponsibility economically that we see in this country, guess what? They deem these institutions that operate off fractional reserve banking too big to fail. But when I'm in debt and I'm struggling to take care of my family, I don't get a bailout. They don't say I need a bailout. They don't say I'm too big to fail. They say pay this debt or live under the thumb of having to deal with what life is like under an immense amount of debt, or file for bankruptcy, same thing. Again, we got to understand the rules to the game that we playing. Why is this important? Why is understanding the economic system that we have to exist in so important? Because the economics of this country is what controls everything. Now it goes back to my original conversation, why I felt it important to start talking about the history. America fought for its independence. And by all intents and purpose, America in 1776 won its independence, in theory. But when you look at the control of the financial interests, of the global financial interests, America has never been a free country because it's been under the thumb of financial oppression. How do I know that? How do I corroborate that? Well, let's start talking about some other examples that we see in history. Let's go into the Caribbean. Let's talk about Haiti for a moment. Haiti won its independence how long ago? In theory, Haiti has been under the thumb of French colonial financial oppression. They have literally been paying, Haiti has been paying France debts to France since they quote unquote won their independence. And you can do that for many Caribbean nations. Let's talk Africa as well. Many African nations are still paying debts to the colonialism, to the country that colonized them during, guess what? The Berlin Conference. Now you see how it's all connected. This is why I'm telling you, just follow the pathology of behavior. Their mouths will say anything, but one thing that they're good at is documenting history. So when you look at the history, it's so evident to see. This idea of freedom that we exercise in America is just the illusion of inclusion, because as long as I keep you under that perception, then let's go back to what Lyndon said. Now we having a full circle moment, right? Lyndon B. Johnson said, make the poorest of the poor white feel like they better than the most esteemed black. And he will never acknowledge or even pay attention to your hand in his pocket. If you give him someone to look down on, hell, he'll take the money out of his pocket and give it to you. Why is that important present day? Because while we so busy fighting each other over political ideology, liberal, conservative, left-wing, right-wing, Democrat, Republican, there is a financial interest that exists on a global scale that's influencing the things that affect us most as individual civilians in this country and abroad. And because we're too busy fighting over with each other, we don't even recognize their hand in our pocket. And as a matter of fact, we'll even perpetuate the propaganda for them if they make us feel esteemed enough. If they give us somebody to look down on and fight with, we'll validate their existence. History is the greatest teacher. And one thing that I've learned, again, I told you, and I still stand on this, trust but verify. One thing that I've learned is that if you study history, you can see the consistency and the pattern of behaviors. The words change, the faces change, the names change. The pathology is exactly the same. You can almost set your clock to it. So now when I see the social chaos that exists with this last election, when I see the polarization, when I see the infighting, when I see the incitement of racism and all of that, the most powerful tool for control is fear and ignorance. And the last piece of that is use fear and ignorance to create division, and they'll spend all their time fighting each other, never identifying who the true enemy is anyway. It's the perfect crab in a barrel complex, because we all understand that crabs in a barrel will fight each other trying to climb out the barrel, but we never, ever, ever ask the question, why was the crabs in the barrel in the first place? In its natural habitat, the crab don't have to worry about pulling another crab down in order to experience the liberation that he's used to seeing. It's only when you change the environment that what was a benefit to the crab's existence become a detriment, because the only way the crab can elevate in a barrel is by pulling another crab down to get progress. This is what we face with present day. This is what plays into the psychology of racism. This is what plays into the psychology of economics. This is what plays into the psychology of the social landscape of why people behave the way they behave, because they're unwittingly, and we are unwittingly, pawns on the devil's chessboard. In the moment we take a step back and take a macro look and not be so consumed in a micro and see what's going on and see the forest for the trees, I guarantee you we'll stop voting for the axe. But as long as we stuck in this macro worldview, as long as we can't take a step back to objectively look at how we got to where we are, then we will always vote for the axe. Because to the uninformed, he looked like he one of us because his handle is made out of wood. Not knowing the head of the axe is the very thing that will be to our detriment.